Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host, Bob Scott, former co-founder of Kansas City Fellowship and author of Some Say They Blundered, Breaking My Decades of Silence on Mike Bickle, the Kansas City Prophets, and the International House of Prayer. Bob, it's good to be back, and very excited for today's topic because it's one that really fascinates me in multiple ways. Because I was raised under this. I thought that this was a biblical core doctrine, that all Christians must believe this. And even after my family had escaped the cult from which I grew up in, I still thought that this was the way things were supposed to be in Christianity. So as I started visiting new churches, I applied the new church framework of doctrine and framework of authoritarian control, basically off of what was programmed in my head. And it took me a long time because nobody ever really stopped and said, you know, this is not how it is. This doctrine that you came from is false. So you assume it's true. And what I'm talking about is the Fivefold ministry. There is a passage in the Bible that talks about the different roles in which people play, some being apostles, prophets, teachers, etc. I get that it's there, but the way that Latter Rain twisted this turned it into an authoritarian pyramid of control. And basically it was a way in which they could manipulate the masses. So it fascinates me that this exists, but even more, it fascinates me how many people still submit to that type of authority.
Well, I think where it gets confusing is because the way that it's written, it says first apostles. And people assume that first means,
right,
you know, they're the highest rank, right? You know, and it's all ranked. And then prophets, they're ranked number 2, you know, evangelists number 3, right? And it's a pecking order.
Right.
But it just happened that the apostles came first because they happened to be all students of a Jewish rabbi called Jesus, right?
Yeah. And when you mix in the Joel's Army nonsense with all of this, now it becomes a militarized version of authority, you know?
Well, yeah, right? Because apostles are generals. You heard that whole, you know, what do they call that? That connection there. It's like if you're apostle, you're a general.
God's generals.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I've always felt was that it's almost like sometimes with these scripture verses, you know, it's like they get twisted to fit a need. Like we need to have structure and hierarchy, so therefore let's fit this verse as the foundation on which we're going to build this hierarchy, right? In my reading of the New Testament and the Gospels and things like that, I see it very differently because even the word ministry, right, that we throw around is basically a Greek word that means wait on tables. It's a servant, right? In other words, it has the exact opposite connotation as how we see it today. So, you know, I grew up Roman Catholic, right? And so when the priest came in, right, to an event, he was honored. He got a special place of preference, right? You know, it was like a big honor, especially if you were an Italian family, if you had a son or a cousin or somebody that was a priest, right? It was a thing of stature. Yet the whole tone and direction of the word ministry in the New Testament is about serving others.
Absolutely. I mean, right. even in Matthew 20, it says, you know, the rulers of the Gentiles, and Jesus goes on to have this concept of the authoritarian structure of the Gentiles. He says, it's not so among you. Whoever is great among you must become the least among you, basically. They must become a servant.
Yeah, and so deacons, you know, the concept of deacons and all that, these were men or women who were helping the poor or the widows, right? They were serving the community, but they were serving the community with their most basic needs, right? They were waiting tables, as it were. They were washing feet. They were making sure people had food, shelter, right? It was very pragmatic. and
Yeah.
whatever. It wasn't the kind of world we see it now, where it's something that you get ordained to do in an institutional structure, and now you get to be a deacon at your church, right?
Right.
You know what I mean? And it's a stature, right? It elevates you above everyone else, right?
Yeah.
And
in some of the Pentecostal circles, they have the foot washing ceremonies. I don't know if they did this in International House of Prayer, but Jesus is basically taking all of the people who are wearing sandals, their feet get dirty because of all of the sand, and the lowest form of servitude among everything that they did was washing the feet. And so he's basically teaching them, if you want to be like me, you will humble yourself to the lowest possible way that you can be, and you'll wash one another's feet. What's funny is it wasn't until, I want to say it was like 3 years after I left the Branham cult, and I just suddenly noticed, wait a minute, these new churches we're attending don't do this. Why? Because Jesus said to do this. And then I began to realize that, no, that was set as an example. And in today's world, man, who cares about the feet? We're all wearing shoes. We don't have sand. Right. And it has an entirely different meaning in today's world. It's
a cultural context in the New Testament, right? Because these are people that wear sandals,
Right? Exactly.
who have, are coming into a house with dirty, smelly, stinky feet from walking, right? Yeah. So it's kind of like, it's like if somebody came to your house and they're tired and exhausted, and you sat down and gave them a foot rub.
Right.
It's like your wife. I've had a rough day, honey. Can can you massage my feet? Right. It was that kind of a thing. It was, it was a kindness. It was hospitality is really what it was. Right. I think, though, to your point, that example at the Last Supper is really quite profound.
Right.
That if Jesus is in fact the Son of God, right, that he would, as Paul said, take the form of a bondservant and humble himself, right? It's like here is this person who in every way should be revered, right? Who should be set apart, who should be other, who is at the top of the hierarchy. And yet here he is on his hands and knees doing the servant thing. Right? Because it typically wasn't the owner of the house. It was the servant who washed the feet, right?
Right.
So I'm just saying, I've always read that. And then sometimes I actually get a tear in my eye because I think it's just profound. Yeah. It's just so humble. Somehow or another, we've lost all that. We've lost that heart, that posture of heart in ministry. And it's, Jesus talked about, how when you go to an event, don't sit in the first seat. You know what I mean? Don't walk in there because, you think you're somebody and sit in the first seat. You go sit in the back and wait to get invited.
Yeah.
Right. There's just all these stories and parables that he talked about, right? Where it's all about not being defined by your role.
Right. And that's really the key issue here, is because they've turned they call it the offices. If you're in one of these movements, these are the offices of prophet, and there's no biblical concept that teaches this as an office. Depending on how the text is translated, and I've read a few different translations, you can't apply a status of hierarchy with all of the teachings of Jesus. You only can, if you try to make this doctrine fit, you have to pick and choose which sayings of Jesus that you're going to listen to. And my question after leaving this religion for, a few years, why would you not pick all of it? If you want to listen to the words of Jesus, why pick and choose just a few? But the problem, because of latter rain and because the doctrine became so widely accepted, not everybody stayed in latter rain. So some of these ministers left the latter rain. Some of them left Pentecostalism altogether, and they, entered other denominations. In fact, during latter rain, all the denominations were welcome. So they even had participants who weren't Pentecostals. And it's not that I'm speaking out against Pentecostalism by no means, but this doctrine was widely accepted by a majority of people who were in Pentecostal circles. And then that broadened once the other denominations picked it up. Now, I've had interactions with local pastors whenever, when we attend churches, and I can almost tell you which ones have read the words of Jesus and which ones have been influenced by latter rain, because there's just this air about them that they're greater than everybody who's in their congregation.
Well, I'm of the perspective that what's called the Fivefold ministry is not about hierarchy. It's about function. It's about what they do. So, for instance, Paul talked about himself as an apostle, right? Well, what did the apostles do? Well, what we know is that the word itself means ambassador. So he was apostling. He was being an ambassador. That was his role, right? And so what we know, or we think we know from history, is the apostles scattered, right? We see Mark down in Egypt, right? We see traveling, and as they're going and traveling, right, they're ambassadors for what? They're not, what's this interesting, they're not ambassadors for the church. No. They're ambassadors for the kingdom of God, right? That's one of the other interesting little twists here, because we always say church, church, church. Jesus never talked about church. He talks about the kingdom of God. And everyone in the early church, what we call the early church, was actually focused on, I'm in the kingdom of God, right? And so so a lot of Paul's terminology is actually very secular, right? Like his word for the church is ecclesia, right? Yeah. Which is a political thing. It's where, the Greek men gathered, right, to vote. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. He uses, all right, and the word for apostle is ambassador, right? So one of the fascinating stories to me is Paul's interaction with Agabus, right? Because now you have these two things, right? You have apostle and you have prophet, and they have this interaction, right? And initially it looks confusing if you don't understand Paul's worldview, because here Agabus tells him, if you go to Jerusalem, you're in trouble. So don't go. Like he's warning him, don't go to Jerusalem, because if this happens, you're going to get, arrested, right? Whatever.
Yeah.
Paul goes anyways.
Right. That's
Why?
One of the things that was really shocking to me whenever, so after we left the Branham cult, there was no Bible study. This concept didn't really exist. We had things that we would call Sunday school or Bible study, but generally it was studying the words of the prophet, because he was the top of our tier. Mm-hmm. And when we entered a normal church that had a normal Bible study, and I became involved with the men's studies, etc., they began talking about some of the meanings behind the words, which was a new fascinating concept for me, because I had only read the King James Version, and I thought all other versions were evil. That's how we were trained, right? And I'll never forget this one guy. This guy was very intellectual, and he was a deep thinker, and he started explaining in a very easy way for me to understand that one single word in the King James Version that I was reading, it might take an entire paragraph of words for me to understand the full meaning of what was being said. But because it was being translated for English, you can't go word by word and write a paragraph for each word. And likewise, whenever you try to understand how the differences came to be between all of the different versions of the translations, there exists other issues with I don't know if you've studied text criticism, but how the Bible came to be itself. It was the result of translations and copies of other copies. So as I'm beginning to unravel all of this, he starts talking about the word apostle, and he's going into the Greek meanings, which I'm not a studier of Greek. I know it. I know basically I can look at the symbols and I can see that they look fascinating, but beyond that, not much.
It's hieroglyphics.
It's hieroglyphics, man. But the word came from the root to send away. Mm-hmm. And that shocked me, man, because in the Pentecostal circles that I came from, there was not a single apostle that got sent away. Not one.
Exactly.
None of them. They wanted to be kings
sedentary.
of their kingdoms. Yeah, it was like a Game of Thrones, man. They wanted to be in their kingdom, and they wanted their servants.
So circling back to the Paul Agabus thing, here's what I think's going on. Agabus is absolutely right. He sees something. But it gets down to, this is fascinating to me. How do I interpret that? What does that mean, right? And here's why Agabus is telling him, don't go, you're going to get into trouble, because that's what he sees, right? He thinks that's bad. I think because Paul is a sent one, he's an ambassador, right? He looks at it as opportunity. See, what Paul understands, which turns out to be true, is that if I can get to the rulers of these territories, these provinces, these nations, with my message of the kingdom of God, right, I can change a culture, right? I can introduce the gospel to the masses, because in those days, everything went through the rulers, right?
Right.
So, what we know as the Catholic Church grew not because Billy Graham crusades in Colosseums, is because if one of the ambassadors, one of the apostles in the 5th century got to a ruler and he converted to Christianity, everybody in that nation converted to Christianity, right? That's it. It's what happened in Rome, right? Everybody always thinks it's Constantine that changed everything. And what people don't understand, it was Constantine was the one who just abolished the persecution, right? And embraced Christianity. But it wasn't until 2 emperors later that Christianity actually became the official, religion of Rome, right?
Right.
And so, but see, that's exactly what Paul wanted. He wanted to get to those guys, right? It didn't happen for 300 years, but him going to Rome, and his mind was, I'm in proximity to the emperor, right?
Exactly. And if you think about what happened and apply it to the models that we see today for the Fivefold ministries and in what developed into the NAR, it's so upside down, because the apostle, like we said, is an ambassador, somebody who's sent out. And it isn't that they're sent out to become an authority over a region. It's so that they can humble themselves enough to teach other people how to learn Christianity and how to teach others. In other words, we want to empower the little people to help this religion spread. And that's how it spread. But in today's world, it's not like that. There is no empowerment of the little people unless you're outside of these circles that have this fivefold ministry structure. In the fivefold tiers, they do not want the little people to supersede the authority of the tiers.
I sort of wonder if apostle is actually missionary. In other words, when I see what missionaries are kind of defined as in our modern church world, that to me is the closest sort of expression of what I think apostle was, right? They're missionaries, right? They're ambassadors. They go, right? So to your point, one of the things that I ended up uncovering in my little curiosity and research is when I was in Bible school as an 18-year-old, trying to read all these heroes of the faith, the Hudson Taylors, the C.T. Studds, all these great, missionaries of India, China, and Africa, right? They were always the heroes of the story. And as I learned from Norman Grubb in the 80s, the reason why they were the heroes of the story was the London Missionary Society was the primary funder for missionaries. So all these reports that came back to London were all embellished because they needed everybody to know how successful they were so they could get more money. Right?
It's always about the money.
Right. Well, and remember, Norman was the son-in-law to C.T. Studd and the friend of Evangeline Booth, so he had a front row seat at all this. What was discovered years later when missiologists got into the kind of research mode, what they discovered was that in reality, the vast amount of converts in Africa, China, and India were actually converted by their own people. In other words, these guys, they went in there, but they were able to find 2 or 3 key people, right? Teach them, but it was those that went out and preached the message. It wasn't the CT Studs and the Hudson Taylors, and I can't remember the lady in India, but they weren't the ones holding the meetings.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's all these people that got no credit, right?
Yeah.
And the white guy from England or the woman from England, right? They got all the credit, even though they didn't actually do the work.
Exactly. That's one of the problems I have when I hear the phrase hero of the faith right now. I know that it's wrong for me to do this, but I associate it with a cult type environment because heroes of the faith in the Bible, this concept defies the teachings of Jesus. You are supposed to humble yourself. Like I said in the Matthew 20 example, the least among you is the greatest. And what you're describing with the missionaries, I think you're right. I've almost came to the same exact conclusion because in that structure that is mentioned in, I can't remember where it's from, Ephesians somewhere, I believe, Ephesians 4 maybe. In the structure that's mentioned, they do not mention the missionaries, but that's what the apostles were doing. So as they're going out and humbling themselves, they set the model for other people to teach others about Christianity and to help them become Christian leaders. So this is the most important role in the entire kingdom of Christianity as it existed back then, but it wasn't important in the way that it's being taught today. It's not like they're heroes of the faith. It's like they're the ones who spread it the furthest.
Well, one of the things that I think has gotten lost and why in some ways I think the modern church has sort of gone off the reservation is that not only was Jesus' teaching focused on relationship over structure, right? He never built a structure. That's something I find interesting, because there's all this stuff about Jesus building his church. And I'm looking at this going, where? Like he's
years later.
He's either a reformer of Judaism, right?
Yeah.
Or he just doesn't care about institutionalism because all he's got is these 12 students, right? That are kind of traveling with him for 3 years and they're witnessing all this stuff. But even at the end of that, they're not even really sure what they're doing. They don't show up for the crucifixion and they only kind of get it after Jesus comes back after he's resurrected, right?
Yes.
And then Pentecost hits, right? And suddenly these scared little confused men become these little dynamos. But again, what are they doing? They're traveling, right? So the reason why I say it's relational is even in these situations with the missionaries, what were they doing? They were going to these nations. They were building a relationship with the indigenous people, the key leaders in the indigenous of the indigenous tribes, as it were. But they had all the relationships. And so in my view, when I look at it, Christianity moves relationally. Right? That's the track, if you want to say. That's how the message goes. It goes relationally. It goes through people who know each other, right? Families, friendships, associates in business, right? It moves relationally. There's very few people that tell a story that somehow on their own, without any influence, suddenly discovered God.
You got to be kidding me. The disciples didn't have a leadership conference before they went out.
Well, and what's even more fascinating about that whole thing is the relationships even within the disciples. You got three sets of brothers.
Yeah.
So half of the disciples are brothers, right?
Right.
And they're all from this little area, right? Which is not even the spiritual area, right?
Yeah.
None of them are from Jerusalem. Like I said to somebody the other day, I go, think this through. This is kind of wild. If you were going to start a movement, a religious movement in the first century that was going to change the world, right? Given our modern mindset, what you would have done is you would have gone to Jerusalem, which was the epicenter of the ministry world, and you would have picked the theologians and the scribes and the preacher, right? You'd have gone there.
Yeah.
Jesus ends up picking 11 small business owners and an ex-government employee.
The whole strategy just defies, it is in complete opposition with what we see today, because there was no, so in the Fivefold ministry, there's this concept of controlling doctrine. One of the reasons why that the tiers exist is so that if a person in a lower tier steps out on doctrine and goes into a doctrinal division, the one at the top can decide which is the correct doctrinal split. That's one of the reasons why this exists. But look at the apostles. They fought with each other over core doctrines in the Bible, right?
Right.
So the fact that we see them fighting, the fact that like you described them scared disciples, the fact that they did not know that they were intended to be an authoritarian figure tells you plain and simple that this was not meant to be.
Well, I mean, it's obvious when you read the New Testament that there's a perspective collision between Peter and Paul, right? And why?
Yeah.
Because Peter, who grew up under the Roman oppression, who is part of a whole culture that is waiting for the Messiah to come to free them from the tyranny of the Romans, who are massive crucifiers, right? I mean, everywhere they go, they're putting people on crosses, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they were terrifying, right? So here's Peter, who lives under this incredible oppression. He's living under the Nazis of the ancient world. And Paul's coming along going, well, but we need to let the Nazis in the church.
Yeah.
Right. And Peter's going, what? You know what I mean? It's like, what? I mean, Peter just had a really hard time with this. And you can understand why. I mean, he'd seen Jesus wasn't the only person Peter had seen crucified. Right. And so this is hard, and Paul's coming from way north, right? He's in a completely other part of the world that and very much more Greek, right? There's a much more, so it's kind of interesting to me. I just think one of the things that gets missing in a lot of these worldviews is people don't take the time to go back and study the anthropology and the history and the culture of the time, right? They don't really, one of the things I always try to do, not only when I'm reading my Bible, but just in between all that, is read other sources, because I want to understand, how are these people thinking? Like, what is their view of the world? Because if you don't understand their view of the world, their perspective, you read these things completely out of context. And to your point, you end up developing these wild theologies that are so disconnected from the earth, the dynamics that, that they were actually taking place in, that we get these weird, kind of worldviews, and we've lost a lot of that. I mean, as you all know, there are recorded stories of biblical stories, not necessarily the New Testament, but a lot in the Old Testament, from the other cultures.
Right.
The Assyrians have a different worldview or a different perspective of different battles they had with the Israelites. The Bible has a Jewish perspective. The Assyrians have an Assyrian perspective of the same event.
Yeah.
You would not know they were the same battle.
Exactly.
Right.
One of the problems that I have with the Fivefold ministry doctrine is the fact that whenever there's something that is really, really important that's mentioned in the Bible, it's stressed very clearly. You understand exactly what the problem is and how to avoid it or how to fix it. The Bible's pretty clear whenever it's something that's important. When it's something trivial, it might be mentioned casually. There is no clear description of what these roles and these offices are. And because they're so obscure and people are trying to turn them into something that's really not in the text, they have to go outside of the text to try to define what these roles mean. And a problem with this existed in latter rain. William Branham, who's the king prophet among all of them. They were all respecting him as the Elijah that came, which Charles and I are going to get into that some in our revival history. But they all respected Branham as the chief prophet. Well, Branham was very narcissist, and he wanted control. But as prophet, he wasn't at the top of the tier. It was the apostle that was at the top of the tier. And so Branham introduced this doctrine that claimed that Paul was the prophet for his age, so that he could mix the offices of the apostle and the prophet, which is kind of funny if you think about what happened in today's world, because when you go and listen to these apostles that exist today, none of which go out and are missionaries like we've described, many of them want to also hold the office of prophet for their kingdom. And they want to be the one who prophesies and the one who is leading through prophecy. So they too are mixing the roles. And that's largely, I think that's why they chose Branham as one of God's generals, because he created this roadmap for what this should be. And again, back to the original problem, the roadmap for what this fivefold ministry hierarchy should be, if it were to be a true biblical doctrine, you would find it in the Bible. You wouldn't find it so obscured. Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support.
In the charismatic Pentecostal world, this whole prophetic thing, which was so central to the KCF world that I was in, and many other things, it's, because people don't have a grasp of world history and culture and all that, they sort of see this thing, prophet, as being this uniquely Jewish or Christian thing, right? Not understanding the fact that every single culture in the world had a prophet. Prophets. Now, they didn't always call them by the same name, right? But prophets in almost every culture were a part of the king's cabinet. They didn't have a role over people. They had an advisory role to a king, right? And so when Joseph, let's just take Joseph as an example, right? Joseph is, he's a Bedouin, and people don't understand that most of the Old Testament is tribal. I mean, they don't even understand that about the whole Arab world right now. Everybody thinks Arab and they think Islam. They don't really understand that in the Arab world, these are all Bedouin tribes. These are people whose ancestors lived in tents and traveled across the desert grazing their herds, right? That's what the Hebrews were, right? So Joseph goes down. He's they're herdsmen, they're traveling around, and he goes down to this culture, this civilization that's been around for thousands of years. It has massive buildings, it has language and government and, music and, it's an established culture. He's just a little hick, in their world, like, He's just like the country bumpkin that shows up there, but he kind of ends up, because he's smart, he ends up making his way through. And then suddenly he's standing in front of Pharaoh. But who's around Pharaoh? You have this whole group of people. You have astrologers, right? Because in the ancient world, people thought that the stars, right, could, predict the future. So he had astrologers in the king's cabinet, right? You had soothsayers. They would cut open animals, right? And based on the entrails, they would get messages, right? It's just, this goes on, right? No, this isn't just unique to Egypt. This is every single culture, right? And then you've got all the, right, and then you have the prophets, right? And the prophets were the ones who's supposed to know the mind of God. So the reason I bring this up is that in every conflict that you see in the Old Testament, it's really a battle between our gods and our prophets and your gods and your prophets. And whoever wins has got the real ones.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's how it was viewed in the ancient world, right? So, it's, you read all of this stuff in the Old Testament about Israel and all these prophecies about Israel. Every single culture had the same thing. Every single culture had a history that God ordained them to be. And they were to rule the world. Every one of them had priests and prophets and, that promoted that. And so when these battles happened, that's really what it was. It was sort of like this tug of war between our gods and your gods, right? That's why there's all these incredible stories about the underdogs, which are these little Hebrew people that are basically don't have any civilization until the time of David, which just starts to become something, right? Up against these big cultures, the Assyrians in the north, the Egyptians in the south, the Babylonians in the east, and they're stuck in the middle of all this.
Yeah.
Right. So the whole idea of prophets is, again, not a uniquely Christian or Jewish thing.
One of the problems for today, we have separation of church and state. And because of this, we grew up in a world that did not have what you're describing. And a lot of people just don't care about history, so they don't understand that this is how things worked. What's interesting is we've come full circle because the NAR wants to reintegrate the church and state and set up this exact structure that you're talking about. But like you said, every civilization had their prophets, and those whose prophecies failed, they didn't last very long. They were usually killed, put to death. But because of all of this, because we've lost focus on that history as a Christian nation, and because of the influence of the latter rain, people have redefined what it means to be a prophet. Yeah. I don't know, you've probably got it too. I've got it several times. You can look through the comment feeds and see it. But because I started in opposition to one or more of the cults, I get often members of the cults who come in and say that I'm a false prophet leading people astray. I can't tell you how many times they've said this. I have yet to have prophesied something. So it's kind of odd to me, because that's like the number one. If there was a biblically defined office of a prophet, he would have one job. That's to prophesy. That's to speak the words of God. But they have been so twisted into what they think that a prophet is, that what they generally equate it to is, if somebody is in opposition to my cult, they must be, the leader among them must be a prophet, because my cult leader has taught us that he is a prophet and he is our leader.
Well, this gets a little odd to me. Again, this is my weird worldviews, and people can take it or leave it. But one of the things that you begin to realize when you read these Old Testament prophets, that none of them were professional prophets. Like, there is no job as a prophet. They were all farmers, or they worked in God, right? They all had other jobs. That's one of my huge, and I mean, I wrote about it in my book. I have a huge problem with this whole concept of traveling prophets who get offerings. Like that, they have this ministry that I'm a prophet, and I go around to these churches and I prophesy, and I get paid for that.
It's so odd, man.
But I mean, it's so normal. This is what's so strange to me, is that in the Pentecostal world, like, if you say that to people, they just kind of look at you and give you what I call the head tilt, like, huh? Like, it's so ingrained in people that that's normal. And yet what you see when you study it is most of these people they were making their money either as farmers or carpenter, like they had skill sets, right?
Yeah.
And then on the side, they had, they would write these things or make these comments. Even Isaiah. I mean, there's a lot of people talk about Isaiah was in government. That there's enough in here that it looks like he was somehow connected in the political world, but they didn't make their money prophesy. I just find that whole thing bizarre. Like, and not only as bizarre, but slimy, right? I just think it's slimy. It's like
Absolutely.
and I told a story in my book about, even with Paul Cain, I challenged him on his whole stadium vision, right? Because, every time he would share it, he gets standing ovation and everybody's like jumping up and down and they're all excited, and you got guys like Lou Engle that go out there because of this prophecy, and they're gonna pack out stadiums like Billy Graham did because of all this. Only what I knew, well, I intuitively knew it, and so I pressed him on it. I said, as well as I know that you're only telling half the story. And he started laughing, right? He got this funny look on his face. He goes, "How did you know that?" And I go, "Because I know." And he goes, "Well," and what I'm talking about is that all the context for all of it was that there had been some sort of cultural civilization collapse, and these stadiums were empty. Like they were right. The reason why there's no sporting events is because all of that had gone. The whole professional sports world had disappeared, and they were just these, empty stadiums.
Right.
And I said, that when you saw that the context was there had been major collapse, civilization collapse. And he looked at me and goes, "Well, if I told people that, they wouldn't invite me back."
Well, therein lies the other problem I have with this, man, because exactly. In the Bible they had scribes. The scribes would write down what the prophecies were, and so that years later, if the prophecy came to pass, the scribes could pull out the document and or the scroll, and they could look at it and say, "Look, this is exactly to the letter what was said." But these guys in today's world, man, they revise the prophecies and they try to make it fit. And it's like straining at a gnat. If they can find one little word within the prophecy that matches in any way, shape, or form what happened, they say, "Look, I'm the prophet."
Well, I'm going to get myself in trouble for saying this, but as you know, I've always been very honest with you, and I understand the fact that I'm on a journey and I don't know everything. In fact, I don't know most things. I just know a few things. And one of my perspective is I don't really think we got any prophets in the church at the moment.
At least not the ones who claim they are.
Well, if you really want to unpack this, I could show you all kinds of movies in Hollywood that were, if prophecy is about the future, right? Predicting the future, if that's one aspect of it, Hollywood and authors are far more accurate and far more on point about the future than anybody I've ever seen in the church world.
Yeah.
Right? Like we can go back and we can look at films that were done 30, 40 years ago. And here we are now, years later, and exactly what they showed in the movies has happened. Right. But at the time, everybody thought, the Isaac Asimovs and the Ray Bradburys and some of these futurists, right, that everybody just thought, well, he's dreaming. Right. He's just whatever. Well, those guys ended up being far more accurate with far more weighty things than anything I've seen in the church world.
Yeah.
Most of what I've seen in the church world that's deemed prophetic is encouragement. Right. Yeah. And we need that. I'm not at any way suggesting that we don't need to be encouraged and we don't need, right. But just say it what it is. I want to encourage you. This whole thing that God showed me, you know what I mean? It's like, I had this revelation, you know what I mean? This need we have to position ourselves as some sort of this elite, having this elite connection with God. I watched Mike do that for years. I mean, the sad thing about KCF is that many of the things that I experienced with Mike early on, where he would define things as I had an impression. I had a sense, right? I feel this, right? over time, as these guys who supposedly had revelation, the Bob Joneses, the Paul Caines, the John Paul Jacksons, the Augustine Acalas, all those guys came in, those stories got switched to, I had a revelation. God showed me. I was taken to the third heaven, right?
Yeah.
And to your point earlier on in our conversation, that stuff morphs.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Right? It morphs. But why does it morph?
My opinion is, so I've heard this phrase often. I had a revelation. In some cases, I was around whenever the quote unquote revelation happened, and it was nothing more than an opinion. I had an opinion, and these men are not brave enough to say, look, I had an opinion of what might happen, and it did happen. Because you're caught up in this world of angels and demons, you say, I had an opinion, and there it happened, so therefore God must have given me a prophecy. And what's funny, it goes back to what I said earlier, we've lost the meaning of prophet. When you describe a prophet, even in the description that you just gave, you're talking about the future events. There were two categories in the king's kingdom of his advisors. You had the fortune tellers and you had the prophets. The fortune tellers are the ones who predict the futures. That's why it's called fortune. It is your fortune. And according to the Mosaic law, these are the guys that you stone because this practice is evil. Right? But in today's world, most of the prophets that I have heard about something that they claimed as prophecy, it's usually borders on the edge of what you would call fortune telling. And if you read the Old Testament and understand the Old Testament, God gave Moses the Mosaic law and said that if you keep this law, these 300 blessings, and it's just a number I pulled off the top of my head. These approximately 300 blessings will come to you and your people. But if you break them, here are 300 curses that will come to you and your people. And most of the prophecies, if you read them and understand what they're saying, it is because that there was some law that they had broken, some rule that they had violated of the old covenant, and God spoke to the prophet and predicted that a bad thing was about to happen because of the bad thing that they had already done. So it wasn't a prediction of the future so much as it was God saying, look, you guys are messing up again. Why don't you get straightened up?
So you appreciate this. So I'm in a business meeting yesterday. We were at a company meeting. We're all sitting around the boardroom table with the owner. And, we're trying to solve snow problems. And I'm sitting there and I get this idea, right? It just pops into my head. And I end up sharing it with him. And he's like, oh my God, that's brilliant. He's like fist bumping me, right? Now, in the business world, that's just a good idea, right? But somehow in the Pentecostal world, that's turned into...
Yes.
Right? You see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, it was spontaneous. It just popped into my head. Nobody in the business world would call that prophetic.
Right.
They just like you were inspired or something, right? But in the church world, somehow that all gets flipped over into, oh my God, he's a prophet. And he had a revelation, and it all gets twisted.
Yeah. And I don't even so much have a problem with that. There's this saying among the Pentecostals and some charismatics that everything that happens because of God, whether good or bad. And if you have an opinion of what is about to happen in the future and it happens, then you could say that opinion was divinely inspired. God was giving you some clue. I don't have a problem with this. The problem that I take with it is when you're conditioned to believe in this way, it goes straight to your head. The people who do it, I've watched it. I've watched the people have an opinion that came true, and I can tell you exactly what was said. What they said was an opinion. They had no way to they didn't even come close to saying it came from God. But after it happened, this was a prophecy from God. I must have had a prophecy. God spoke to me because they've been conditioned to think this way. And the real problem that I have is that conditioning is harmful, because take some of the examples we've seen. Once a person who's got some severe issues gets that into his head, then gets into the authoritarian ladder of fivefold ministry control, climbs up that ladder, now you've got a real problem.
I think Paul talks about, the gifts, and he kind of compares it to the body, right? And it's this, that, and everything else. I mean, I have my own kind of word picture, and it's basically we're tenders of a garden, just like Adam and Eve, right? In the beginning, we're tenders of a garden, and we have tools, all these various tools, a rake, a shovel, right?
Yeah.
All these different things. But the idea is these are tools to tend the garden, right? And to circle all the way back to the beginning of our discussion, these are servant tools.
Yes.
Right? These are tools to tend the garden, to feed people, right? This is about how many, where this whole thing has gotten twisted because of this whole fivefold hierarchy thing, is suddenly now it's become a status symbol, right? It's become this, this hierarchical thing where it establishes your pecking order in this institutional world. And I think it's gotten so completely distorted. And I think that's why we've gotten so much trouble with the prophetic. I think it's so distorted right now, right? That here we have, people now, and this is what's so sad because, as we were talking before we got on the air, there's a lot of people getting busted right now for what they call data mining, right? That they go on social media and they get information, and then they stand up in front of an audience and they call somebody out and they pretend that they're prophesying, that they have revelation from God. See, everybody is getting mad because the person did that. The way my mind is wired, because I care so deeply about people and I've spent my life trying to help broken guys in the ministry. My question is why do you need to do that? In other words, what's in your broken soul that you're so desperate to be seen as a prophet, right? That you'll resort to any sort of manipulation so you can get reaffirmed, right? You see what I mean? There's a desperateness. It's sort of pathetic, I guess, is the way that, as I'm kind of articulating this, there's a patheticness to it, right? It's like they're trying to find esteem and affirmation and, some sort of stature with this. And it's kind of pathetic.
It is.
Right? It's broken, insecure men trying to pretend there's something that they're not so they can get affirmation.
Yeah.
And once you begin to see the brokenness of it, right, it's like, yuck, this is sad in a way. So I know that, again, I have a different reaction. So many people are angry right now. I'm sad.
Yeah.
My personality, it doesn't get angry anymore. I hurt because it's like, gosh, that's so sad. You're so broken. You're so, the word wannabe, that's been around for a long time. I think the church world is just filled with all kinds of wannabes. And so that's to getting back to our discussion about the fivefold. It's like there's this desperateness to be defined, to be given one of those titles, right? Because it reaffirms to you that, gosh, I'm somebody, right? It's kind of pathetic.
Yeah. Well, it borders on theatrical. One of the problems that I saw early on was this movement. It was a form of entertainment, which back during its era, the tent revivals, these people didn't have much else. You go out into the country, there wasn't movie theaters. Some of this started before even television and the early days of radio. So they didn't have much. And these people would go to anything, some traveling road show where you're going to go. And they're selling hot dogs out front, and it's more like a traveling circus. And if you were good at it, you could attract a lot of people. And over time, this became... It tied into the movie industry. I think, I don't know if you've seen it or not, but in my research, I've tied it directly to the Kardashian family. Dima Shakarian was, part of the Kardashian family.
Businessman.
Yeah. Exactly. So all of this has this theatrical aspect to it. But the problem is, like you said, whenever you try to whenever you try to build yourself up to be something that you're not, you're up on this ladder that it's very hard to get back down from. And while you're up there, a lot of the people, they don't even want to be up there. That's the funny part. They're trapped in their own world of their own making. So it is sad. Right. I'm sad for multiple reasons, but one of the reasons that makes me sad is that this continues today, and we have seen some vicious leaders that are just ruthless. They're abusing people, etc. I see this as continuing because as long as the people will uplift this type of religion, then they're going to continue to have these types of people.
Yeah, I just did a Facebook post yesterday about this subject because there's, guys that have for various reasons had to step down out of ministry, right? That are now either making or planning a comeback, and it's got people knickers in a twist, as they say.
Oh yeah,
right. Like people are really upset. And it kind of surprises me because, like, well, wait a minute, this has always been that way. Like, there's nothing new here.
I know,
right?
It's going
on.
Like,
and why
on
are you suddenly? But what I realize is a younger generation who just doesn't have a good grasp of church history, and so they're horrified right now that this is happening. But again, if you're a historian, there's like nothing new here. Welcome to the church world, right? At the same time. What I talk about is, here's the other frustration. The other frustration is they're angry at the other church leaders for not calling these guys out.
Yeah.
Right? Which is never going to happen. Because again, it's like, I wrote about in the book, in a dysfunctional family, they circle the wagons, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the ministry world circles the wagons. They will protect their own. And the reason they're protecting their own is because many of them have all the same problems, right? And so it's, there's that. But what I'm trying to get people to understand, it's not really a leadership problem, right? It doesn't really matter what other leaders say. Because what these guys all understand is there's always people out there that are looking to be led and fed.
Yeah.
And they're going to show up. In other words, this doesn't stop until people stop giving their money and attending these guys' meetings, right? And so the problem isn't other leaders saying, this guy's off base, because even if they do, people will still follow.
Yeah.
Right. And so, I don't know that this is a solvable problem. There's just this need in some human beings to be led. Like they need somebody to tell them what to do, how to do it, when to do it. Right. They want to abdicate their responsibility to govern their own life and defer to somebody in a position of authority. And these guys all know that, right? They all know that they're very persuasive, right? And they know that if I can just get one or two rich guys, right, because of the 80-20 rule, 80% of your money comes from 20% of your people.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing, everywhere, even in business. So they know if I can just get one or two rich guys, I'm back.
Right.
And I may not have hundreds of thousands of people, but I'll have thousands.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And so that's the real thing for me. It's like, if we're going to stop that, then people have to stop it. Like, don't keep pointing your finger and getting mad at some leader, right? They're not the problem. It's the people that show up to the meetings.
Yeah, it's almost like a chicken or egg thing for me, because the people have been manipulated and trained to be sheeple. They've been trained to seek leaders instead of trained to become leaders. And it all goes back to the upside down model. If from the inception of all of this mess, if they were teaching people to rise up and become leaders, that mindset would have entered American Christianity and gone abroad into worldwide Christianity, that to become a Christian, you train others to become Christian leaders. And everybody who is a entry-level person who's just understanding Christianity, they come in with the aspiration to become a leader and to lead others. That's the model that is described in the Bible, but not at all the model. Yeah, discipleship. It's not at all. Even the word discipleship, they've twisted its meaning to mean something else. But anyway, we could go on for hours on this, but I have a severe problem with this doctrine, and I'm shocked that it is allowed to continue. When you look at, like we talked about, the discipling, the shepherding movement, you find key figures who will rise up and say, that's wrong. But they'll still teach this doctrine, not understanding that it's really technically the same thing. They're still propagating the same thing. So we could go on forever, but thanks for doing this. This has been great.
Well, we're getting ourselves in trouble here, but I hope people understand we're just two guys trying to process our experiences, right? And, I was just realizing this the other day. I am on the verge next year of been in this ministry world for 50 years.
Wow.
Now, I left the ministry world in 2000, but, I've kept on the periphery of things. So whether people like it or not, I got a few experiences. I have a front row seat at some things. So my opinions and my perspective aren't based on pulling stuff completely out of the ether. These are, real world experiences. So, that's what they are. They're our perspectives.
Well, that means something. There's a lot to be said about experience and just the history that's in your head. I want to, over the course of the next few weeks of podcasts, just extract some of that. So, well, if you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For more about the dark side of the New Apostolic Reformation, read Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR, available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.